member-led forum and the chair of this program. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. John Cannell, who will speak on the topic, Vitamin D, its role in risk reduction for autism. Dr. Cannell is a psychiatrist working in Southern California. He formed the Vitamin D Council in 2003. He believed that there were likely bad consequences of getting so little sun exposure and wanted to do something about it. So he founded the Vitamin D Council to educate the public on the importance of sun exposure and vitamin D. This organization publishes a weekly newsletter sent by email and has a large set of information about the health benefits of vitamin D and ultraviolet radiation for a number of diseases. He has made several important contributions to the understanding of the role of vitamin D in optimal health. His first was proposing that influenza is largely seasonal due to seasonal variations in solar ultraviolet B radiation and production of vitamin D. His paper, published in Epidemiology and Infection in 2006, is the paper in that journal with, I think, the highest number of downloads and citations. The second important contribution was his hypothesis that solar UVB and vitamin D reduce the risk of autism. This was outlined in a paper in Medical Hypotheses in 2008. He has published 3 additional papers on this topic and has also investigated the role of vitamin D in treating those with autism. His third contribution is reviewing the benefits of vitamin D for physical and athletic performance, resulting in the book Vitamin D's Effects on Health and Physical Performance, published in 2010. Dr. Cannell.
While we're getting my slides, I've got too many slides, so I'm going to have to fly through them. But vitamin D is not a vitamin. That's really important to understand. Vitamin D is not a vitamin. A vitamin is a micronutrient that can be obtained from the diet. Vitamin D is not obtained from the diet at any meaningful extent, unless you eat 5 or 6 servings of cold water fatty fish a day, or you eat reindeer meat, or you eat lichen or seagull eggs. It's just not obtainable. It was made in the skin. It was always made in the skin upon ultraviolet radiation. And it's not a vitamin like an antioxidant or a cofactor in an enzymatic reaction. It's a prehormone. That is, it's the only known substrate of a steroid hormone, and all seco means is one of the carbon rings is open. But it's a steroid hormone, just like progesterone or estrogen or testosterone or cortisol. It's a steroid hormone. Activated vitamin D is a steroid hormone. And the only way that steroid hormone can be formed is if there's enough prehormone available. And there's increasing amount of evidence that modern man has little of the prehormone available, and thus has widespread vitamin D deficiency. And that means in the brain, that the activated hormone, the calcitriol, is not available in sufficient quantities for adequate brain development. There are multiple mechanisms of action in which calcitriol, activated vitamin D, is involved in brain development and brain health. And we're not going to talk about many of them today. I'll just mention a few of them. But that's the important thing to understand, is that vitamin D is not a vitamin. It's a prehormone. So, as a disclaimer, I receive royalties from Purity Products upon their sale of vitamin D. I have an Autism and Vitamin D book to be published soon. I have, I'm the executive director of the Vitamin D Council. We're a nonprofit. And I just say, for years I had no conflicts and no money. Now I have a little money and I have some conflicts. So I just the original theory for autism and vitamin D can be traced back to Professor John McGrath in Australia. And he theorized that vitamin D was a candidate risk factor for the neurodevelopmental disorders, and autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder. In 2006, Bill Grant and Carly Soules found that UVB correlated with autism rates before 1985. And then in 2008, I wrote a paper about it in the Medical Hypothesis. I'm proud to say that paper in Medical Hypothesis is the most cited paper in the history of the journal. So more and more people are picking up on this theory. And in 2010, 5 Harvard researchers accepted the theory and modified it a little bit. And then Professor Gilbert, who's one of the most best-known autism researchers in the world, Christopher Gilbert, recommended urgent research into the field of vitamin D and autism. And very recently, Gentile and colleagues from Italy modified the theory, and I think it's probably right, that vitamin D deficiency, either during gestation or early toddlerhood, damages the immune system. And then when a genetically predisposed fetus or toddler is confronted with an environmental injury, for example, a virus or toxin or Tylenol or an immunization, that damaged immune system causes an autoimmune disorder, which is autism. Autism is an autoimmune disorder like rheumatoid arthritis or systemic lupus erythematosus. These children make autoantibodies to their own brain. One thing that's very important to me is parsimony, and parsimony is a simple concept. It means that one needs to explain the most. How do you go back on this, Bill? I'm just doing this with these. Anyway, I hope I can go forward. Vitamin D is not a vitamin. It's made in the skin. It's a prehormone. This last reaction, by the way, from pre-vitamin D to vitamin D is a heat-dependent reaction. And nobody has written about it, but I believe sunburns have a Darwinian purpose. I believe that if you get a sunburn, you make more vitamin D than if you don't, because this final reaction is heat-driven. So it's not working, Phil. The system is not going forward or backward. Oh, okay. So while he's getting the technician, let me talk about parsimony. Parsimony is a simple concept. It means that the theory that's probably right is the theory that explains the most facts without making a new hypothesis. So what we're going to talk about are the number of facts that the vitamin D theory explains. Facts about autism. Now, these facts, when they were discovered, they were not thought to have anything to do with vitamin D. They're just facts about autism, scientific facts about autism. So we will see how many facts the vitamin D theory can explain, and that without making a new hypothesis, and that would be what parsimony is. Well, Occam's razor is another way of saying it. Now, there's 2 theories now in the literature. It's commonly held that the lesion in autism occurs during gestation. That is, the lesion in autism that occurs when the mother is pregnant. That's what's commonly held. I'm reviewing that evidence now, where it came from, but I don't believe that, and I don't believe that for a simple reason. We run a free clinic for parents with autistic children for the last 1.5 years, and I've treated probably 30 children, and almost invariably the mothers say the same thing. They say, this infant developed normally. This infant had normal eye contact. This infant smiled. This infant followed me around. This infant sat up at the right time. And then somewhere around the age of weaning, this child stopped developing, or in some cases deteriorated. Now, there's a minority of parents who say this infant was never normal. That's a clear minority. So I believe that the lesion occurs during toddlerhood and not during gestation in the majority of cases. This is a study. This is if you wear a bathing suit in the summer, you make this much vitamin D. If you wear summer clothes in the summer, you make this much vitamin D. In the autumn, with autumn clothes, you make this much vitamin D. And in the summer with sunscreen, you make that much vitamin D. Summer clothes with sunscreen. So you can see what the effects of clothing and sunscreen are on vitamin D production. Here sort of follows us. This is what's happened to us as we've evolved. And we're up here now. we're inside almost all the time. Whether sun avoidance has worsened in the last 5 years, nobody knows, but certainly I think as the tech revolution has evolved in the last 5 years, there's more and more avoidance of the sun. Last week there was this article about skin aging and sunshine, and that article that will drive people out of the sun more than skin cancer will. So, and to make the amount of vitamin D that this person's making, you have to drink 50 glasses of milk. 50 glasses of milk to make the vitamin D that's in the natural environment. And this is a way of showing it. This is where primates are. This is where humans who live in the sun are. And this is in the middle, and the lowest is where modern man lives, at usually 15 to 20 nanograms per milliliter. Ideal vitamin D levels are probably natural vitamin D levels. That is, what are the vitamin D levels of humans who are hunter-gatherers who live around the equator? That's the question to be answered. And Luxwolda answered it just recently, and the answer is it's 46 nanograms per milliliter. So you should ask your doctor for a vitamin D blood test. And if the level is below 40 nanograms per milliliter, you should supplement or get sunshine. Do not just be calmed if your doctor says the level's okay. You need to know what the level is, and it's okay. Some doctors think 21 is okay. It's not. 21 is not okay. You want a level of at least 40 nanograms per milliliter. Now, it's important to note that this sort of behavior is new to the human brain. Human brains have never developed in this way. This is an extreme of sun avoidance. Here's another example of an infant at a pool with sun avoidance being, this is new to human brain development. It's never occurred before, to my knowledge, in the history of man. It's like this, there was this gigantic open trial. And what happened in this trial is scientists said, okay, we're going to cut off the source of vitamin D to children and pregnant women. And we're going to see what epidemics occur as a result of that. That's the study that's occurring, because when we recommended sun avoidance, and I was a general practitioner before I was a psychiatrist, I recommended sun avoidance, so I'm blaming myself. When I recommended sun avoidance, I did not recommend compensatory oral supplementation. That is, I didn't say to myself, well, they're not going to be going out in the sun anymore. They need to take enough vitamin D to make up for that difference. And nobody ever has, and nobody has yet to do that. No scientific organization has yet to do that. Sun avoidance advice works. The AMA first issued it in '89, the Council of Scientific Affairs. The American Pediatric Association went further, and they recommended that young children always stay out of the sun. And by 2001, the Centers for Disease Control said that that advice was working, and our children were basically all sun deprived. And the recent Food and Nutrition Board, the 2010 Food and Nutrition Board on supplements and adequate vitamin D did not compensate for sun avoidance. Autism appears in early childhood, and it has a number of symptoms that we're not going to talk about. Only to say that DSM-5, which is now out, which is in the bottom here, has only 2 categories that you have to fill. One is a social communication deficit, and there's no checklist on this. It's just a subjective response from the diagnostician. And the second is a checklist. You have to, I think, meet 3 out of the 5 criteria for repetitive interests and behaviors. And the DSM-5 says that any child currently diagnosed with autism or autism spectrum disorder or any of the autism-like disorders should be given the diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. So that's important. There's a lot of common beliefs about autism. One is that it's a genetic disease, and so it cannot be increasing dramatically. That's the better detection theory. That is, we'll talk about that. Then autism, the next is autism cannot be a genetic disease because it's dramatically increasing in incidence. That's the environmental toxins only. Then autism is caused by vaccinations. Most experts think not. That the 4-to-1 to 5-to-1 male-female ratio means the defect is on the sex chromosome, but geneticists can't locate such a deficit, such a defect. There are probably many environmental triggers for autism. That vitamin D deficiency impairs the immune system, and so there are many environmental triggers.
To my knowledge, no one until this conference has looked at the genetics of vitamin D in relation to autism, but I see there's one paper on it at about 2 o'clock this afternoon. And they found a significant odds ratio for common genotypes and autism. It's not intuitively obvious, but vitamin D levels are relatively highly heritable, especially if your levels are less than 30 nanograms per milliliter. That is, it's thought to be oligogenetic. That is, a few genes determine what your vitamin D level is. Now, if your vitamin D level gets up to natural levels, around 50 nanograms per milliliter, it's almost all environmentally determined, either from sunshine or from supplements. But the heritability estimates range, depending on the study, from 43 to 80%, so it's fairly highly heritable. That's why there's such a variation in how people respond to supplements. Some people will get a level of 80 on 5,000 units a day, and some people only get a level of 30 on 5,000 units a day, and that's due to either obesity or the main factor is genetic variation. And epigenetics I'm not going to talk about, but it's thought to be involved in vitamin D metabolism. There's a number of papers on that at the conference today. There are 5 striking epidemiological features about autism, and that's that the monozygotic to dizygotic twin concordance rate shows that up to 90% of identical twins, if one twin has autism, the other twin will have autism, whereas if your brother or sister or dizygotic twin, only 10% of them. That's the first epidemiological features. The second is there's widely varying phenotypes or clinical presentations of autism, even among monozygotic twins. There's a striking male to female sex ratio. There's a starkly increased prevalence among dark-skinned immigrants in sunny lands, and there's been an apparent rapid rise in incidence over the last 30 years. So any theory of of autism has to explain those 5 facts. Remember parsimony, and parsimony I've already talked about. This is the curve of autism prevalence. This is according to the National Institutes of Health. This is what's happening, and it's only one of the 4 epidemics that are occurring for our children. The other 3 are asthma, which peaked in 2000, autoimmune disorders, which is still peaking, and food allergies. Food allergies, when I was a kid, were basically unheard of. Now up to 10%. 10% of the children in Brisbane, Australia have a challenged food allergy. That is, if they say they're allergic to peanuts, you bring them into the office, have some adrenaline available and a CPR available. You give them peanuts and see if they get hives or difficulty breathing. That's a challenged proven food allergy. 10% of the kids in Brisbane, Australia have a challenged food allergy. I find that statistic amazing. And I find this statistic amazing. When is this going to peak? I think the latest study was 1 in 50 children have autism. And what's the cost to the society going to be? This is a prevalence by age. There are studies that show that vitamin D levels have fallen dramatically, and that a majority of children have insufficient vitamin D levels. One thing to think about are toddlers. When I was a toddler, I was weaned on vitamin D-rich cow's milk, and many people in this audience were weaned on vitamin D-rich cow's milk. Ask yourself where a toddler gets his vitamin D from. He's definitely not getting it from the sun, because he stayed inside, or if he goes out, he wears sunblock. He or she is not getting it from their diet, because they're not going to eat fish or reindeer meat or seagull eggs. And they're not getting it from a supplement, because studies show only about 16% of American toddlers take a supplement. So you can ask yourself, where are toddlers getting their vitamin D? And the answer is they're not. They're not getting it. At least I can't think of a way they're getting it. The geneticists say that this curve is due to better detection. That's what the geneticists say. They have to say that because there's no way a genetic disorder can explode in prevalence or incidence. Unless there's more genes in the gene pool, and autistic individuals tend not to reproduce, so there's not more autistic genes in the gene pool. So the geneticists have to say that. That's a better detection theory. Now, what's the implications of the better detection theory? Now, first of all, autism is not subtle. There's nothing subtle about autism. These kids are hard to miss. They often don't speak or speak in a strange manner. They have no friends. They often have repetitive behaviors, and they usually fly into rages if their routine is interrupted. So they're very difficult to miss. The better detection theorists are saying that the pediatricians and the parents and the teachers in the 1950s and 60s and 70s missed this diagnosis. When you think about that, that's ludicrous. Or the other way we say that in medicine is it has no face validity. That makes no sense. Now, neurosteroids are a good candidate for risk factors in autism, like John McGrath first hypothesized, because there is one neurosteroid that's affected by the environment. The other steroids are not particularly affected by the environment. If you get pregnant, you don't have to eat special foods or take a special supplement to make enough progesterone. Your body will make enough progesterone on its own. The same is true for cortisone when you're under stress. The same is true for testosterone when you're developing. Your body will regulate the amount of steroid hormone in your body, except for one steroid. It can't regulate the amount of calcitriol in your body because there's not enough substrate available. That's important to understand. There's not enough prehormone available for the body to regulate. There's lots of different mechanisms of action of how vitamin D affects brain development, and we're not going to go into those. Here's another way of saying all the different mechanisms of action that vitamin D has on brain development. And it also has on ongoing brain function. Glutathione is a good example. Cysteine, which is an uncommon amino acid, is the rate-limiting step for the production of glutathione in the brain, which is the master antioxidant. But once the glutathione molecule is formed, the rate-limiting step for glutathione is an enzyme that is upregulated directly by vitamin D. So if you don't have enough vitamin D in your body, your brain does not have enough of the master antioxidant it needs. And that's only one of the antioxidants that are involved by vitamin D, and it's only one of the mechanisms. Another mechanism that's important is that there have been at least 5 genes identified that code for DNA repair enzymes. Your DNA is in constant state of need of repair, and they're proteins that specifically repair your DNA in a matter of microseconds when there's a lesion in it. And DNA and vitamin D upregulates at least 5 of those proteins, those genes. There are 5 studies of vitamin D deficiency in autistic individuals. All 5 of them show vitamin D deficiency. Remember, we're only talking about children with a genetic load for autism, so it's expected that they're not going to be different from typically developing children. But it should be low, and it is. I found 2 papers, one from 1912 and one from 1938, that showed autistic symptoms with rickets when rickets was common. And interestingly, the autistic symptoms disappeared with vitamin D treatment. That's the important fact. When I came across this, I realized the theory was probably true. This is an experiment of nature in which there are extremely high vitamin D levels in pregnancy and early infancy. It's called the Williams syndrome. These children's typical personality is the opposite of autism. They're overly friendly, they've got great eye contact, they make friends easily, they're not obsessed, they don't fly into rages, they're easygoing kids, and as a general rule. So this is an experiment of nature that is consistent with the theory, and it's called the Williams syndrome. We're going to go through now facts that the vitamin D theory explains. The vitamin D theory would predict that vitamin D-rich fish reduces the symptoms of autism, and it does. 2 studies show that. The vitamin D theory would predict that there are abnormal bones in autism, and in fact there are. This is an NIH study. The vitamin D theory would predict that children are either, the lesion either occurs in gestation or pregnancy, or it occurs in early toddlerhood. Like I said, I believe that the majority of the lesions occur in early toddlerhood, but that's a minority opinion. Most autism people suggest it's a lesion during pregnancy. So far, 8 anti-neural autoantibodies have been detected in autism. 8 antibodies these children have to their own brain, 8 different antibodies. And the two that have been 2 of them have been tested to see if they're associated with autism severity, and they are. The higher the level of the antibody in the in the child's blood, the worse the autism. Another fact that the vitamin D theory would predict that well-educated, rich parents are more likely to have an autistic child because they're more likely to wear sunblock. And in fact, that's been shown to be true repeatedly. Vitamin D theory predicts that medications that lower vitamin D levels will increase the risk of autism. And in fact, they do. And that's been shown in a number of studies. The vitamin D theory would predict that seizures are common in autism, and they are. Up to 50% of the children with, or up to 40% of the children with autism have seizures, and vitamin D lowers the seizure threshold, increases the seizure threshold, which means it makes seizures less likely. And a controlled study has shown that. The vitamin D theory would predict that there's a seasonality to autism symptoms if the lesion occurs during toddlerhood. That is, if the lesion occurs during toddlerhood, parents who have a swimming pool and let their child out all summer should notice that the symptoms are less in August than they are in February. And parents, we run this free, we have run in the past this free autism clinic for parents treating their autism with vitamin D. And every parent that has a swimming pool has told me the same thing. The child's symptoms are better in August than they are in February. And there's a Japanese case report that shows exactly the same thing. This is the seasonality of these symptoms. One was behavioral problems and the other is sleep, both showing a distinct seasonality. The vitamin D theory of autism would predict that there's a latitudinal effect, and Grant found that in 2006. The vitamin D theory would predict that UVB radiation is directly related to the incidence of autism or the prevalence of autism. And Bill Grant was nice enough to include me on a paper in which he analyzed all 50 states based on UVB irradiation and found that I think the R value was 0.58, wasn't it, Bill? Something like that. So you can see that it's not a minor effect. The children from states with a lot of sun were much less likely to have autism than the children from states with less UVB radiation. Season of birth, the vitamin D theory would predict that winter birth makes autism more common, and in fact it does. Vitamin D theory would predict there's an urban-rural gradient, that is, it's more common in the cities and the countries because the city gets less UVB, and that's a fact that's been shown to be true in a large meta-analysis. The vitamin D theory would predict that air pollution is associated with more autism, and in fact there are at least 2 studies that show that to be true. The vitamin D theory would predict that clouds and rain are associated with autism, and Waldman first published his paper in I think 2008, and his initial theory was that it was television viewing and that triggered autism, because children who had to be inside a lot in bad weather were more likely to watch TV. But when he published a paper in JAMA Psychiatry or JAMA Pediatrics, he amended the paper to say that it was more likely to be the vitamin D that is being affected by clouds and rain. The effect size in this paper was not minor, is a significant effect size. The vitamin D theory would predict that closely spaced pregnancies are associated with increased risk of autism, and it's true that they are. The vitamin D theory would predict there's an abnormal immune response in autism that's similar to the autoimmune response is significant in vitamin D deficiency, and both of those statements are true. The vitamin D theory would predict that vitamin D deficiency in animals alters brain function, and I've underlined or I've bolded the names of 2 researchers from Australia, John McGrath and Daryl Iles. When I started reading them in 2004, I was amazed that they find. They do animal and in vivo research, mainly animal research, and they developed a rat model of vitamin D deficiency, and they looked at the behavioral symptoms. And like I said, John McGrath in 2001 hypothesized that neurodevelopmental disorders are probably related to vitamin D, but they have a lot of papers out and a lot of basic science. There are 36 proteins dysregulated, at least, and vitamin D deficiency, and they have to do with lots of stuff that I don't understand because I'm a psychiatrist. I'm not a scientist. I should have put that in my disclaimers. I'm not a scientist. I'm an activist. I was an emergency room doctor for a number of years, and then I was a GP for a number of years, and now I've been a psychiatrist for the last 20 years. So a lot of what's going on in this vitamin D conference I can't follow because it's basic science research. So it's important to keep that in mind that I'm not a scientist. This is more on the mechanism of action of vitamin D and autism, and we won't go into that. The vitamin D theory would predict that children with autism or animals with autism have abnormal brain sizes and shapes, and in fact, the animal models of vitamin D deficiency are very similar in terms of brain shape and brain size to children with autism. It's increased and skull size is increased. Vitamin D, I think I told you that glutathione is a master antioxidant, and vitamin D is involved in binding two glutathione molecules together to make it active again. I think it's called glutathione thioreductase, I think. Now this is interesting. This is a recent study Mustafa published. These parents, they were controls, typically developing children and children with autism. The parents reported the same amount of sun exposure for these children. So the parents reported these children had the same amount of sun exposure, but their 25-hydroxy vitamin D levels were distinctly different. So that is consistent with it, that there's a genetic mechanism that's involved in vitamin D metabolism that's also involved in autism. Anti-MAG antibodies are one of the 8 autoantibodies that are associated with autism, and what Mustafa found was that these autoantibodies were indirectly and strongly associated with vitamin D levels. I think that R value was like 0.84 or something, very high. And this is the only evidence in the literature that I'm aware of that suggests that vitamin D might be effective in the treatment of autism, because this is showing that the higher your vitamin D level, the lower your one autoantibody is, and autoantibodies are associated with the severity of autism. So this paper suggests, certainly doesn't prove, but it's one possibility is that if these children got higher vitamin D levels, they may have less symptoms, fewer symptoms. This is the vitamin D theory would predict that the mothers of these children have increased incidence of autoimmune disorders, and they do. The vitamin D theory explains the 5-to-1 male-female sex ratio because estrogen shields both the vitamin D receptor and it shields the 25 to 125 process, that is the process of making activated vitamin D. That is, if you have estrogen, it facilitates that reaction. If you have testosterone, it does not. So there's not a new hypothesis that has to be made to explain the male-female sex ratio. Bill has, I think, another thought on the male-female sex ratio. It has to do with the fathers getting impregnating mothers at a later age, but I'll let Bill explain that. The vitamin D theory of autism says that autism should be more common in African Americans, and the CDC has found exactly that. There have been 3 studies that have shown that it's higher. 6 studies, that found this more common in blacks. This is a quote. I'll give you time to read this quote. This is a quote from a newspaper reporter in the Minneapolis Post in 2008. Short yellow school buses deliver children with special education needs to Minneapolis public schools every weekday morning. As students arrive at the elementary school where I work part-time, I can't help but notice something about the autistic kids as they climb down from the bus's steep steps. Almost all are Somali children. There is no name for autism in Somali language. There's no name for it. It doesn't exist in Somali. But in Sweden, Somalis call autism the Swedish disease. And in Minneapolis, where there's lots of Somali immigrants, they call it the Minnesota disease. The American disease. But there's no word for autism in the Somali language. Gilbert found that the incidence of autism in children born to dark-skinned immigrants was 200 times higher than the general population. Black women are severely vitamin D deficient. They're much more likely to be vitamin D deficient than white women. Prenatal vitamins do not prevent vitamin D deficiency. Prenatal vitamins contain basically homeopathic amounts of vitamin D. They will not prevent vitamin D deficiency during pregnancy. If you know anybody who's pregnant, they should be on 5,000 IU a day in early pregnancy, 6,000 IU a day in later pregnancy, 5,000 for the mother and 1,000 for the fetus. So vitamin D, I'm not going to go through this, but vitamin D explains the 5 major epidemiological features of autism. At least it has explanations for it. The vitamin D theory can be easily tested, especially in toddlerhood. You just look at the children who were given vitamin D supplements in toddlerhood, see what the incidence of autism or prevalence of autism is in that group compared to children not given the supplements, and see if there's a difference. It's very easy to detect that. It's a little harder to do studies from pregnancy, but it's useful to do. I predict those studies from pregnancy will not be positive because I think the lesion occurs in toddlerhood. The prevalence increases. In a recent South Korean study, the estimate was 1 in 36 children in South Korea have autism. 1 in 36. Is it going that way in the United States? Well, that's what the curve shows. When will it level out? I don't know. The epidemic of autoimmune disorders among our children has not leveled out. The epidemic of food allergies has not leveled out. Luckily, the epidemic of asthma leveled out in the late 1990s. This is a calamitous epidemic. This is going to bankrupt this country. Studies showed that a family with a child with autism were under more psychological stress than a family with a child who has a fatal illness.
Wow.
And much of that has to do with these children are unhappy. And one of the great satisfactions I've gotten from treating these children with vitamin D is almost always the unhappy children are turned into more content, happy children. And I have no scientific statistics on that, but that's what the mothers tell me. And that's very gratifying to hear. As any parent in this audience can tell you, if you have an unhappy child, it will make you unhappy. So then the question is this autism epidemic iatrogenic, or that is it caused by the medical profession? And if it is from due to vitamin D deficiency, it is caused by the medical profession. So never in the history of the world have so many people been damaged by advice like sun avoidance advice without compensatory oral supplementation. Most researchers will not research something with the word vitamin in it. They won't do it. They just think it's nonsense because vitamin C and vitamin E and vitamin A, the randomized controlled trials that they did, the larger randomized controlled trials showed no effect size. So the studies with vitamin A showed that it was detrimental. Don't take supplemental preformed retinol. Don't take any supplemental vitamin A. You don't need it. The problem is subclinical vitamin A toxicity in this country. So we funded a study at Moffitt in an open trial in which they're using high-dose vitamin D to treat children with autism. I wrote the protocol for that study, and it's recruiting now. We had this free autism clinic. We educate parents about vitamin D deficiency with telephone calls and Skype sessions. My hopelessly subjective impressions are that about 25% of these children respond dramatically to the point they do not have the diagnosis anymore. About 50% of these children respond significantly, so the parents say, yes, there's a distinct, clear improvement. And about 25% of these children don't respond at all. That's my hopelessly subjective. What seems to predict response is a younger age, and that would be predictive. It's an autoimmune disorder. The less time the brain has been attacked, the more it's likely to be reversed. A distinct seasonality of symptoms, those patients always respond. Milder disease, and then the period of normal early infantile development. If I get a child whose mother says, yes, this child was always abnormal from the minute it was born, I don't think the vitamin D is going to help the child, but I don't stop trying because of that. And there's about 20% of autism that has a known genetic case, like Rett syndrome or or Fragile X syndrome. If you have one of those, vitamin D does not appear to help. Now, this is our organization, and it's been for about 11 years. I started about 11 years ago. So now I'll open it up to questions.
You were mentioning about the autoantibody issue. Has anybody looked to see whether other autoantibodies are also higher in autism?
No, they have not. And to my knowledge, there's no movement in that area. I just asked a researcher at Moffitt the other day by email if he knew of any researchers who were following up on Mustafa's study, and he said he knows of no researchers who are following up on it. Yes?
At what age do you assume or deduce that adding vitamin D to the diet is no longer effective?
I had two adult autistic individuals. Both of them said, and both of their parents said they responded to vitamin D. Now, the only dramatic responses I've seen has been in younger children.
So, but it might be worth
The question as a clinician, as a scientist, I'm not a scientist, the question would be, have any randomized controlled trials shown it to be effective? That's the scientific question. The clinical question is quite different. In fact, science and clinical medicine have clashing ethics. The ethics of science say don't do it unless they're randomized controlled trials. The ethics of clinical medicine say do everything that's not dangerous that might help. That's what the clinical ethics of clinical medicine are, is if it's not dangerous and it might help, try it. So the risk-benefit ratio for vitamin D supplementation is heavily weighed in the arm of benefits rather than risk. Because even when I use high-dose vitamin D on these children, none of them have hypercalcemia. It's all less than, their calciums always remain normal. Yes?
Yes, you mentioned something called repetitive interest in behavior as a symptom. I'm curious what that is. The second question I have is, how do blacks, heavily pigmented people make vitamin D? And the last question is, how do you balance the trade-off? Because the fairer the skin, lighter the skin, the more sun exposure, the more type of skin cancer like melanomas and basal cells and stuff.
Right. Right, okay, if I can remember all those questions, I remember the first one, and that's, no, I don't remember the first one.
The first question is, what is repetitive interest in behavior?
It's called, in the autism community, it's called stimming. These children stim. That means they do like this. They get something and they do repetitive behaviors. They sometimes hit themselves, they sometimes bang their head, but they'll do the same behavior for hours on end. That's called stimming. And that's one of the criteria. Stimming, not specifically stimming, but repetitive behaviors is one of the criteria for DSM-5, I think. Yes. And your second question?
The second question is, how do blacks make vitamin D with the pigment?
Many of them do not. Many of them show undetectable vitamin D levels, and the majority of them have levels below 20 nanograms per milliliter. Blacks, African American skin is ideally suited for Africa. It's not suited for temperate latitudes. So the answer is, and all the studies I'm aware of show that vitamin D deficiency is a worse problem in African Americans than it is in Caucasian Americans.
And the last question is balancing the incidence of skin cancer with sun exposure and fair skin as opposed to lack of protecting yourself from the sun.
Yeah. Right. Non-melanoma skin cancers kill about 1,500 Americans a year. Cancers associated with vitamin D, as you'll hear from Professor Garland, kill about 1,500 Americans a day.
Well, how about melanomas?
Well, melanomas are more frequent in indoor workers than outdoor workers. That's a fact that the dermatologists seem to ignore. Melanoma is more common in indoor workers than outdoor workers. Okay? That's been shown repeatedly. Melanoma is more common on areas of the skin that are not sun exposed, the upper leg and the lower back. The non-melanoma skin cancers, squamous cell and basal cell, are more common in areas of sun exposure, so you find them on the face, the hands, and the head. So the question, and there are more and more dermatologists now questioning this question of whether or not sunlight is involved in the production of melanoma, other than sunburns, which seem to clearly increase the the prevalence of melanoma. If you get a severe sunburn, you're at risk of developing melanoma. But it's likely that the people who work outdoors are protected against melanoma because they have higher vitamin D levels. And the people who work indoors go out to the beach maybe 3 times a year, get sunburned, and then go back and become vitamin D deficient all winter. So they got 2 things against them. 1, they're getting sunburned, and 2, they're vitamin D deficient. Whereas a roofer in Southern California is going to have sufficient vitamin D year-round because he's got his shirt off, and he's certainly not going to put sunblock on his back. In fact, I don't know any roofers that use sunblock at all. Yeah.
If you do manufacture vitamin D through the skin, could you explain why the supplements work?
Well, I mean, in the natural state, vitamin D is made in the skin. The molecule that you take by mouth is in all ways appears to be identical to the molecule manufactured in the skin. So our recommendation of the Vitamin D Council is that you get safe, sensible sun exposure to manufacture vitamin D. But if you can't do that because you work inside, our recommendation are that you take 5,000 international units a day. You can get 5,000 IU capsules in any drugstore now, or there's a great online distributor, Biotech Pharmacal, which we've assayed their product, and they're always exactly what they say they are. They make a 5,000 IU capsule that's quite inexpensive. Just take 1 of them a day for the days you're not out in the sun. But any drugstore has them as well. Yes?
I don't know, microphone.
Yes.
Okay, yes. This seems to me one of the wonderful things about this hypothesis is that it is eminently testable.
Yes.
Is this UCSF study, in your opinion, a definitive test of the
No, it's an
hypothesis?
open
And
label.
if not, what would you like to see as a definitive test?
It's an open label study, so it's not randomized controlled trial, so it's not definitive. What would be definitive would be a randomized controlled trial of toddlers given vitamin D compared to toddlers who are not given vitamin D, and I think that study would be unethical.
Right.
I don't think it would get past. I don't think it'll get past the review board. So the only study that I think of will be definitive, or as close to definitive as we can see, is whether or not toddlers who take a vitamin D supplement, do they have a lower incidence of autism than toddlers who don't take a vitamin D supplement. That's a fairly easy study to do. I think that the data is probably already there. Somebody's just got to find it. Yes.
I'm wondering if the current lower level of the testing, I think it's 20.
Yes, in some labs it's 20.
Yes, Kaiser. I'm wondering if that should be raised. And is this testing done in infants and pregnant mothers?
It's not done in infants that I'm aware of, and I've never heard of an infant being tested. It's occasionally done in pregnant women, but the most of the testing, and by the way, the vitamin D blood test is the most rapidly growing blood test in the world. And the vitamin D supplement is the most rapidly growing supplement in the world. So, but vitamin D tests are normally done on older people or sometimes younger people if they ask for it. So what's happening all around the country are patients are coming into their office and saying, "Doctor, would you test my vitamin D level?" You know, the level that's adequate is very important. The Institute of Medicine's Food and Nutrition Board says 20 nanograms per milliliter is good enough. But they base that entirely on bone. There's 2 major functions of vitamin D, the endocrine function and the autocrine function. The endocrine function is controlled by the kidney, in which the kidney secretes activated vitamin D into the bloodstream to affect downstream organs, which is a definition of endocrine function. So that's one of the functions. And certainly 20 nanograms per milliliter seems to achieve most of that, probably not all of it, but enough of it. So that's what the Food and Nutrition Board went on, is only on osteomalacia and rickets. They said, we're not going to talk about any of these other diseases because there's not enough data. Now, the Endocrine Society, a few months later, came out with their recommendation. And their recommendation is to keep your blood level at least at 30, and that you take anywhere from 800 to 2,000 units a day. And they also said that you may need more than 2,000 units a day to adequately treat vitamin D deficiency. So there's difference in the recommendations. 5,000 units a day is close to what you need to attain a natural level. And natural is what you want. You want a level that's natural, somewhere between 40 and 70 nanograms per milliliter. Yes?
If there's damage to the fetus due to vitamin D deficiency, is that
actual structural damage, then why, if there's damage, does vitamin D supplementation help?
By definition, there has to be some structural damage because there's physiological and biochemical damage. So there's got to be, but it's probably microarchitectural damage that's done. And because gross pathology shows that infants with autism have increased brain size at birth, and through early development have increased brain size. So there's probably is some microarchitectural. In fact, there are studies. It's very hard to do a brain biopsy. It's not done very frequently. In fact, it's almost never done because you can't justify a brain biopsy. So all the structural damage that's been seen in autism has come from autistic children who've died from other causes and have had an autopsy. And there are distinct microarchitectural changes in those brains. But developmentally, the proteins and the hormones that are involved in growth and differentiation. That differentiation is where the cell specializes. And vitamin D is involved in all of those functions. Yes?
What is your opinion of the Citracal supplement? It has both calcium and vitamin D3.
Well, calcium, it's important to take as much calcium as you need, not to take 1,000 milligrams a day. If you eat dairy on a regular basis, you probably don't need any calcium. You have to eat dairy 2 or 3 times a day to get enough calcium from dairy. Or if you're a vegetarian, you're probably getting enough calcium from the vegetables that you're eating. But most Americans don't get enough calcium, so you need to figure out how much you're getting in your diet and take enough to make up for the difference between the 1,000 or 1,200 milligrams a day recommendation based upon your age. So don't take 1,000 milligrams of calcium a day. You don't need that. You might need 500, you might need 600, but you don't need 1,000. Citracal has inadequate amounts of vitamin D in it. I would not stop the Citracal, but I would get a 5,000 IU bottle of vitamin D and take 1 capsule a day with the Citracal. The amount of vitamin D in the Citracal is meaningless, so it won't interfere with your vitamin D level. Yes?
I have a few questions I can repeat. One is I don't understand, I don't have a good definition of lesion. And then milk used to have vitamin D. I thought they still had it. And I was told for about a year I took 15,000 IUs of D3. I think D3 is the better one.
Yeah.
Now I'm taking 2,000, and I have low bone density, so I'm wondering if you think that's okay.
Maybe you can repeat those questions one at a time.
Can't hear.
So lesions?
Hold the
A lesion?
microphone closer.
I can't hear you.
It's a lesion.
What's
Closer.
Close.
Closer.
I didn't understand lesion.
Lesion means an injury of some kind. That's what a lesion
And
is.
related to D.
Related to development, or related to either a biochemical lesion or a genetic lesion or some sort of damage. My understanding of the lesion.
And that was mentioned in connection with D deficiency?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And milk, I thought they usually added.
Yes, milk contains 400 IU, or supposed to contain 400 IU per quart, but often doesn't contain that amount. The difference in modern children from my generation is that we were weaned on vitamin D rich milk, and children today are weaned on fruit juice. With the exception of some orange juice, fruit juice contains no vitamin D. So the distinct difference between toddlers from today compared to toddlers in the 1970s are that toddlers today have no known source of vitamin D. Unlike when I was a toddler, I was drinking milk. In fact, I used to drink a lot of milk. That might be one of the reasons I'm so tall. I sweat a lot, and when I was a teenager, I used to drink milk instead of water. And I would drink sometimes a gallon of milk a day.
And at what point does it get toxic? Like I took 15,000 for a while, and do you think for someone with low bone density, should I just continue with 2,000?
Two questions. The first is toxicity. Toxicity clearly occurs somewhere around 50,000 units a day, and some people may occur with levels less than that. But not everybody who takes 50,000 units a day will get toxic, but it does occur. And in fact, there's studies, 2 case reports in our conference about toxicity. You cannot get toxic on 15,000 units a day, or at least, it'd be very unlikely. The Institute of Medicine's Food and Nutrition Board listed the no observed adverse effects level of vitamin D at 10,000 IU. That means there's never been a study that shows there's an adverse effect of 10,000 units a day. Now, if you have osteoporosis, it's important to understand that there's much more involved in osteoporosis than vitamin D and calcium.
I take vitamin K also,
Yes.
strontium.
And magnesium?
Yes, that's in the supplement.
Yes, yeah. What bone needs? Bone needs silica, and unless you drink a lot of beer, you don't get any silica, right? You don't get much silica. Bone needs vitamin K2. It's not clear whether enough K1 is made from K2 in the body, so some people think you need to take the K2. You need magnesium. 70% of Americans have an inadequate magnesium intake. There's varying studies about zinc and boron. Boron is not an element that's been described as crucial, but it's involved in the rapid non-genomic action of vitamin D. But there's a bunch of things that are involved that we get enough of, like copper, for example, or manganese. We can get enough of that. So what you want to do is take the right supplement that has the right elements in it and the right vitamins in it that you're not getting naturally. And the best one I know of is called it's Life Extension Foundation sells it, and I can't remember the name of it. Something like Bone Health with K2 or something like that. If you go on their website, you can. It's a good supplement. So the important thing is there's lots of things involved in osteoporosis. There's 2 other things involved in osteoporosis, and one is vitamin A toxicity. I've just written a letter with 20 co-signers, including Walter Willett at Harvard, to the Standing Food and Nutrition Board, asking them to reinstitute a vitamin A food and nutrition board because there's so much evidence there's subclinical toxicity of vitamin A, especially osteoporosis. And we haven't heard back from the Food and Nutrition Board, but I sent it to Susan Murphy, who's the chair, and then all the members and all the, it took me a long time to get all those email addresses, believe me, but I got them. And it took me a long time to get all these co-authors, but I got them, including a number of vitamin A experts who all think, the ones I talked to all think that there's 2 problems with vitamin A. In developed countries, it's subclinical vitamin A toxicity. In the developing world, it's vitamin A deficiency. And when researchers look at these papers, they have to distinguish between these 2 cases, and they don't often do that. The Cochrane meta-analysis that I've seen, that they've never done that. They've taken all the studies from developing world and developed world and commingled them, and it's a different problem. But when they did commingle them, they found a 16% increased mortality in people who take vitamin A supplements. So if you isolate that only to developed countries, the mortality is going to be considerably higher. So that's the first thing that causes osteoporosis, is subclinical vitamin A toxicity. Another probably major factor in osteoporosis is constant low-grade metabolic acidosis. We used to eat vegetables and fruits and whole grains. And for reasons that I don't understand, for biochemical reasons, they produce a mild alkalosis. So your pH is higher than 7.2. Now, the diet that most Americans eat causes mild metabolic acidosis. So most modern Americans, if you take their urinary pH is below whatever the cutoff is, I think it's 7.2. So if you take some calcium and you dissolve it in acid, you can see that it dissolves very well in acid. So modern Americans are walking around with a mild acid environment that's demineralizing their bone. What role that plays is not clear, but it's clear that it plays some role. And there's 2 ways to combat that. 3 ways I know. One is to eat a diet that's a sort of Paleolithic diet with enough vegetables and fruit. Another way is to take potassium. For reasons I don't understand, potassium alkalizes your body. The third way to do it is to take apple cider vinegar. For reasons I don't understand, apple cider vinegar also alkalizes your body. Just a little bit of apple cider vinegar. You don't have to, like a teaspoon a day. So, yes.
I'm sorry I was late a few minutes. We may have covered this, but we hear that we don't absorb vitamin D through our skin as we get older as well. So, could you comment on that, please?
Yes, studies show that the older you are, the less able you are to manufacture vitamin D in the skin. The original studies that Hullock's lab did was on the foreskin of infants to see what the vitamin D manufacturing ability was. When you compare the foreskin of infants to a 70-year-old, the 70-year-old makes a significantly less vitamin D than the foreskin of infants does.